The USS Blackwater had been submerged for 6 weeks when the first man lost his mind. Lieutenant Harris was a quiet man, steady-handed and dependable, but something in his eyes had changed. At first, it was a simple thing. He paused too long before answering a question, stared too deeply at the metal walls as if he were listening to them breathe. Then he started talking to someone who wasn't there. "Who are you looking at, Harris?" Commander Ellison had asked one evening in the mess hall. Harris didn't answer right away. His fork hung in the air, trembling, eyes fixed on the empty seat across from him. "She's saying we're already dead," he murmured. The others turned. The seat was empty. "She?" Ellison pressed. Harris blinked slowly, then shook his head. "Never mind." By the next morning, Harris had carved his own eyes out with a maintenance screwdriver. The Blackwater was running deep-sea surveillance near the Mariana Trench. It was a classified mission. Even the crew didn't know the specifics. They followed orders. Remain submerged, avoid detection, listen. But listen for what? The pressure was brutal. The walls groaned under its weight. The metal, though reinforced, seemed to shift. Small, imperceptible movements. Some men swore they could feel it, like the submarine itself was breathing, swelling and contracting in time with their own heartbeats. Then came the dreams. At first they were normal, a mixture of memories and nonsense. But soon they became identical. Each crewman reported the same vision, the submarine floating in utter darkness, deeper than any map could chart. Outside, something pulsed in the abyss, a vast shape with no definite form, only an overwhelming presence that pressed against the hull. The air inside the vessel turned thick, viscous. The men found themselves unable to move, their limbs bound by unseen restraints. Something touched them, not with hands but with thought. It slithered inside their minds, unwinding their memories like tangled string, whispering truths in voices that smelled of rotting meat. Then they would wake, and the shadows would seem darker than before. One by one, they began to change. Harris was only the first. Next was Petty Officer McAllister. He started to mutter under his breath, though not in English. The words were liquid, curling unnaturally around his tongue. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and the veins beneath it seemed darker, more pronounced. The others avoided him, but in a space so confined, there was no true escape. Hell, they still had Lieutenant Harris's body in storage. Anytime they needing something out of storage, the team would go in with their eyes trained on the floor, careful not to look at the poor man and his mangled face. Blood had pooled beneath him, and a few had stepped in it, resulting in red footprints staining the floor. The air filtration system recycled every breath they exhaled. The water purification system churned endlessly, redistributing every drop of sweat and saliva. They were trapped, sharing each other's tainted essence. One night during dinner, McAllister's teeth loosened. He spat them out into his palm one by one, examining them with detached curiosity. They were wrong. Too long, too sharp, like the teeth of some deep-sea thing that had never known light. "I think we're changing," he murmured. Then in a sudden movement, McAllister jumped on the table, knife in hand, and began sawing at his tongue. His gargled scream echoed throughout the submarine. Then in a swift motion, his tongue fell out of his mouth and onto the top of the table. The man stood and stared for a moment, his crewmates in shock, unable to move or breathe. Then he let out one more primal scream before slitting his own throat. Another body. Soon it was happening to all of them. Ellison tried to keep order, but how does one maintain control when reality itself is shifting? He would look at his men and see their features distort, eyes too far apart, jaws unhinging wider than should be possible. They whispered to each other in languages he couldn't comprehend. The walls pulsed. The metal dripped, slick and organic. He reached out to touch it once, and it was warm. A heartbeat throbbed within. "Sir?" A voice called to him from behind. He turned. It was Lieutenant Beckett, or what used to be Beckett. His face was stretched, elongated, his mouth curled into a permanent grin too wide for his skull. His eyes were gone, but he was still looking. "We need to go deeper," Beckett said. Ellison choked back bile. "What the fuck is happening to us?" Beckett tilted his head, listening to something unseen. His grin widened, skin splitting at the edges. "It's inside us now," he said. Then he collapsed, convulsing violently. His skin bubbled like boiling tar, shifting, tearing, revealing something wet and glistening beneath. His ribs cracked outward. Ellison ran. They were no longer men. Somehow he had made it to the control room. The radio was dead, but the sonar still worked. He activated it, needing, desperate, to see something, anything other than what was behind him. The ping echoed through the abyss. For a moment, there was nothing, just empty water. Then the screen flickered. A shape, impossibly large. It had no defined form, only movement, an endless, writhing expanse that coiled and uncoiled, stretching beyond the edges of the screen. It was not a creature, it was a place, it was a presence, and it had been waiting. Ellison turned slowly. His crew stood in the doorway, what remained of them. Their bodies were wrong, impossibly long, their bones curving in ways bones shouldn't. Their faces were slits of gaping black, their mouths stretching into smiles too wide, too knowing. Their voices overlapped, a dozen, 100, an ocean of them. Their hands reached for him, fingers merging, splitting, merging again like liquid flesh. The sonar pinged once more. Ellison stumbled with his back against the sonar table, slipping on the mess of blood beneath him. Red filled his vision, and he felt a tightness around his throat. Then he began to choke. There was nobody left to save him. His vision blurred and his breaths turned to wheezes, gasps for relief. Then he died. The Blackwater sank. It went deeper than the maps allowed, into the dark, its entire crew laying in bloody heaps on the metal floor. Dismembered eyeballs, tongues, teeth, and fingers rolled along the floor as it sank deeper and deeper. It never resurfaced.